All right, let's jump right in. Today we're taking a deep dive into, well, you could say one of the most impactful military campaigns in history. Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia. You know, those early battles, they don't always get the same attention as the later epic clashes, but they really laid the groundwork for Alexander's, well, his whole legend. Absolutely, and for anyone who loves military history, this is like the ultimate case study. Yeah, and we're talking about a time when Persia, they were a superpower, right? Like, seemingly unbeatable. So, did Alexander, when he first set out, did he actually intend to conquer the whole Persian Empire? Or did that kind of, evolve over time? Well, that's where it gets really interesting. So he inherited this ambition from his father, Philip II, to take on Persia. But the full scope of his vision, well, it probably developed gradually. But our sources, they point to three main factors that really fueled his initial campaign. Okay, so let's break those down. Was the first one. The first one is, well, fulfilling his father's legacy. Conquering Persia, that was Philip's unfinished business, right? And Alexander, as a young, ambitious king, he really wanted to prove himself worthy of that legacy. So it's like a mix of family pressure, and that burning desire to make a name for himself. Pretty relatable, right? Totally. But it goes beyond just personal ambition. Alexander, he drew strategic inspiration from a book, Xenophon's Anabasis. It's this account of Greek mercenaries, they traveled right through the heart of the Persian Empire, and it kind of exposed some vulnerabilities in this seemingly invincible empire. Can you imagine the impact that had on a military mind like Alexander's? Oh, absolutely. It's like getting a detailed scouting report before you launch a major campaign. I bet those insights, like into Persian tactics and the terrain, the logistics, that stuff had to be invaluable for Alexander. Totally. And there's a third factor that's often overlooked. The political climate in Greece. Remember, the Persian sacking of Athens, that was still a fresh wound for a lot of Greeks. So by positioning himself as the avenger, Alexander tapped into this shared resentment, this desire for payback. And that's how he unified the Greek city-states, all these fractured entities against a common enemy. Wow, that's a power move. Yeah. It's not just about military strength, it's about understanding the political landscape and using it to your advantage. Exactly. But let's not forget, even with all this ambition, the strategy, the political savvy, Alexander, he was still facing an uphill battle. His resources were limited, especially at the start. He had to make every single move count. And that braces to the Granicus River. Yeah, Alexander's first major clash with the Persians, 334 BC. And his army, they only had supplies for like a month. If you talk about high stakes, it's like every decision could lead to triumph or total disaster. Yeah, and right away you see these contrasting approaches within the Persian leadership. They had this Greek mercenary commander, Memnon, and he proposed this scorched earth tactic, deny Alexander supplies by burning everything in his path. But the Persian satraps, they resisted that idea. Why would they object to a strategy that, on the surface sounds pretty effective? Well, because it meant destroying their own wealth and their power base. These satraps, unlike Memnon, they had deep ties to the land, to the resources. Burning it all would be like economic suicide. So basically, their own self-interest, it blinded them to this strategic advantage that Memnon was proposing. Yeah, they totally underestimated Alexander's boldness, and, well, they paid the price. Yeah, and that boldness was on full display at the Granicus River. Alexander, he defied conventional tactics. He led this direct charge against the Persian center. A move that was considered incredibly risky, especially with the limited resources he had. I can only imagine the scene, the chaos on the battlefield. The clash of armies, the dust, the noise. That was a serious baptism by fire for the young king. Oh, and he was even more vulnerable than usual because of his armor. You see, it was gleaming, shiny, which made him a prime target for the enemy. But that's where Alexander's elite cavalry, the companions, they prove their worth. These guys were highly trained, fiercely loyal, and they intervened, actually saved Alexander's life that day. Their training and discipline, legendary, right? Almost like a precursor to, like, the special forces units we see in modern armies. Exactly, and their quick action, that's what turned the tide of the battle. Secured Alexander's first victory against the Persians, but it was costly, and it wasn't a knockout blow. Memnon, that wily strategist, he managed to escape by sea. And that's where Persia's naval dominance comes in.
Yeah.
Alexander, realizing his limitations at sea, he made a bold decision. He disbanded his navy, fully committed to land-based conquest, and the audacity of that move.
He really shows Alexander's ability to adapt, to focus on his strengths. He knew he couldn't challenge Persia at sea, so he doubled down on his army's prowess on land.
It's like a masterclass in playing to your strengths. It reminds us that even the greatest leaders sometimes have to make tough choices, adapt their strategies to the situation.
Absolutely. But let's shift gears for a second, talk about a more symbolic event. Alexander's encounter with the Gordian knot.
Ah, yes. The legendary knot that no one could untie, right? And the prophecy said whoever untied it would rule all of Asia.
This story gives us a glimpse into Alexander's understanding of symbolism and how it affects morale. He didn't mess around with the knot, he just sliced right through it with his sword.
Talk about a power move. Decisive, bold, it perfectly illustrates his cut-to-the-chase approach to leadership.
And of course, his soothsayer Aristander, he interpreted it as a divine sign, declared Alexander destined to rule Asia.
Well, whether it was staged or not, it definitely worked, right?
Yeah.
Alexander knew how to turn even a symbolic act into a powerful propaganda tool.
Absolutely. And think about how long that action has resonated. Even today, cutting the Gordian knot, it means finding a bold solution to a seemingly impossible problem.
It's incredible how stories from centuries ago can still be relevant today, isn't it?
It really is. But now let's get back to the battlefield. Alexander, having secured his western flank, he turned his attention east towards the heart of the Persian Empire.
And that's where he faces his next big challenge, the Battle of Assus in 333 BC. That's where he comes face to face with the Persian king Darius III for the very first time.
And this time, the stakes are even higher. Darius has mobilized a huge army. He is determined to crush Alexander and avenge that defeat at the Granicus River.
So the stage is set for a clash of titans. We'll dive into the details of this epic confrontation in the next part of our deep dive. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Alexander's Persian campaigns. Last time we left off with Alexander preparing to face Darius III at the Battle of Assus. This clash, was going to be pivotal not just for Alexander's ambitions, but for the whole trajectory of European history.
You know, it's fascinating how geography can really shape the course of battles. From what I've read, the location of the Battle of Assus wasn't exactly ideal for the Persians. It's almost like the terrain itself was working against them.
You're absolutely right. The battlefield at Assus, it was this narrow coastal plain squeezed between the Mediterranean Sea on one side and mountains on the other. And that really limited the maneuverability of Darius's massive army, especially his cavalry.
It's almost like Alexander kind of lured Darius into a geographical trap, Yeah, knowing how meticulous Alexander was with his planning, I wouldn't be surprised if he chose this location specifically to negate that Persian advantage.
It's definitely a possibility. Alexander, he was a master at exploiting every advantage he could get, whether it was terrain, logistics, even the psychology of his opponents. And he deployed his forces in a way that, maximized the constraints of the terrain, while the Persians, they struggled to maintain their formations.
But even with the terrain disadvantage, the Persians, they didn't just give up, did they?
Absolutely not. In fact, their left wing, which was made up of highly skilled Greek mercenaries, they actually managed to push back against Alexander's right flank early in the battle. And this just shows you Darius's army, they were no pushover.
Right, it's a good reminder that we're not talking about just like nameless hordes here. These were seasoned soldiers, many of them with years of experience fighting for their king and their empire. What I find really intriguing is how Alexander responded to that initial setback. Did he panic? Did he, just stick to the original plan?
He did what he always did. He'd adapted. Seeing his right flank struggling, Alexander, he made this incredibly daring move. He personally led a charge not against the opposing flank, as you might expect, but straight towards Darius himself, right at the center of the Persian line.
Wow, talk about a bold move. To attack the enemy king directly in the middle of all that chaos, that must have taken some serious guts. What was the strategic thinking behind that?
It was a brilliant psychological maneuver. Alexander, he understood that if he struck at the head of the snake, so to speak, it could demoralize the entire Persian army. If Darius faltered his troops, they might lose heart and break ranks.
It's like a high-risk, high-reward strategy. If it works, you could win a swift victory. But if it fails, well, you're deep in enemy territory, surrounded by hostile forces. So, did his gamble pay off?
For the most part, yes. Alexander's charge, along with the relentless pressure from the Macedonian phalanx in the center, it created this panic among the Persian troops who were guarding Darius. Imagine the scene. The king of Persia, surrounded by his elite guard, suddenly facing the fury of Alexander's attack.
I can only imagine the chaos, the confusion. It must have been a major turning point in the battle.
It was. The Persian lines crumbled, and Darius, fearing for his life, fled the battlefield in his chariot. That was the dramatic moment that sealed the fate of the Persian army.
So the king of Persia, he abandoned his troops. That must have been a devastating blow to their morale.
It was. Without their leader, the Persian army, they lost all cohesion, and they were quickly routed. The Battle of Assos was a decisive victory for Alexander. It solidified his reputation as a brilliant military commander, a force to be reckoned with.
This victory, it must have sent shockwaves through the entire ancient world. What were the long-term consequences of the Battle of Assos?
The ramifications were huge. First, it gave Alexander control over vast areas of the Persian Empire, including Syria and Egypt. These regions, they were crucial for their resources and strategic importance, so it expanded Alexander's empire and it depleted Persian holdings.
So it wasn't just about military glory, it was about controlling key territories and resources. What about Darius? Did he just disappear after fleeing the battlefield?
He tried to regroup his forces, but Alexander pursued him relentlessly, kept him on the run. Darius, desperate to save his empire, he actually tried to negotiate with Alexander, offered him a portion of his territory in exchange for peace.
Really? So he was willing to admit defeat, at least partially. What does that tell us about how Darius perceived Alexander at this point?
It shows that Darius, despite his initial confidence, he now recognized Alexander as a genuine threat, someone he couldn't just brush aside. He was desperate enough to bargain, hoping to contain Alexander's ambitions.
But Alexander, driven by his ambition and maybe even a sense of destiny, he refused Darius's offer. He wanted it all.
He wasn't content with just a piece of the pie. His vision was to completely dismantle the Persian Empire and establish his own dominion. The Battle of Assos, with all its tactical brilliance, was just a step towards that ultimate goal.
Now, before we move on to the final showdown, I want to touch on something that I found really interesting. Our source material mentions Alexander meeting Diogenes, the philosopher who, famously lived in a barrel. What was the context of that encounter, and why is it significant?
This meeting, it seems kind of unrelated to the whole conquest narrative, but it actually gives us a fascinating glimpse into Alexander's personality, his intellectual curiosity.
It's like a scene out of a movie, right? A powerful king, at the height of his military success, seeking out a penniless philosopher who rejects all material possessions. What a contrast.
The story goes that Alexander, impressed by Diogenes' reputation, he went to see him and offered to grant him any wish.
I can only imagine what Diogenes was thinking. He was the most powerful man in the world, offering him anything he desires. Did he ask for riches?
Power. His response was classic Diogenes. Yes, send a little out of my sen. He simply asked Alexander to move because he was blocking his sunlight.
It's the perfect example of Diogenes of philosophy. He rejected wealth, power, and fame, chose a life of simplicity and self-sufficiency.
It's such a striking juxtaposition. Alexander, driven by ambition and the pursuit of worldly glory, encountering Diogenes, who embodied the rejection of all those things. It suggests that Alexander, for all his focus on conquest, he was also a man who sought wisdom and different perspectives on life.
It makes him seem more human, doesn't it? He's not just this ruthless conqueror, he's also someone capable of appreciating philosophical insights, even if they clash with his own worldview.
Exactly, but Alexander's journey of conquest was far from over. The Battle of Assos was a major triumph, but the final showdown with Darius was still to come.
And that brings us to the epic Battle of Gaugamela, the clash that would determine the fate of the Persian Empire. We'll delve into the details of this climactic battle and its lasting consequences in the final part of our deep dive. Stay with us. All right, welcome back to our deep dive into Alexander's conquest of Persia. Last time, we left off with Alexander's decisive victory at Assos. That major turning point that set Darius III running and left the Persian Empire, well, reeling.
Yeah, but it's important to remember that Assos, even though it was a huge blow to Persia, it wasn't the end. Darius still had a lot of resources, a lot of territory, and he was determined to make a final stand against Alexander.
So what did Alexander do next? Did he, march straight to the Persian heartland to finish things all?
Not exactly. Alexander, being the strategist that he was, he knew he had to secure his flanks before he made that final push. So he launched a campaign south, capturing these key coastal cities like Tyre and Gaza.
Why are the cities so important?
Well, they controlled vital trade routes, and they were crucial naval bases for the Persians. By capturing them, Alexander not only strengthened his own supply lines, but also really crippled Persia's ability to use its navy. It's like cutting off the enemy's supplies while boosting your own.
A classic example of strategic thinking. He was systematically dismantling Persia's ability to fight a war, while at the same time expanding his own power base. And this is where Egypt comes in, right? I was investing by Alexander's time there. You know how he was declared a pharaoh.
Ah, yes, Alexander's Egyptian adventure. It was a brilliant strategic move. It really shows his understanding of military and symbolic power. By taking control of Egypt, Alexander got access to its wealth, its grain supplies, which further weakened Darius, of course.
And the Egyptians, if I remember correctly, they welcomed him with open arms. They saw him as a liberator, right? Someone who would free them from Persian rule.
Absolutely. The Egyptians had been under Persian control for a long time, and they weren't happy about it. They saw Alexander as a savior, a divine figure who would restore their independence, and they crowned him pharaoh, which solidified his legitimacy in the region and added to his mystique.
It's incredible how he combined military might with this aura of divine favor. He wasn't just a conqueror, he was seen as a god king. So, with his flanks secure and Egypt under his control, Alexander was finally ready to face Darius in that final showdown.
That's right. In 331 BC, Alexander marched east, deeper into the Persian heartland, leading his army towards this ancient city, Gaugamela. And this time, Darius, he was determined to fight on his own terms.
So no more narrow mountain passes, no more coastal plains.
No, Darius had learned from his mistakes at Isis. He chose this flat, open plain near Gaugamela, a place that was ideal for cavalry maneuvers, where his larger army could really have an advantage. He even had his troops clear the terrain of obstacles, making sure his scythe chariots had a clear path of attack.
Well, he was pulling out all his stops. This was it, the ultimate showdown, the battle that would decide the fate of the Persian Empire.
The atmosphere must have been electric. Both armies knew what was at stake. On one side, Alexander, the young, audacious king, seemingly invincible, leading a disciplined force of Macedonian veterans. On the other side, Darius, the embattled emperor, commanding this vast multi-ethnic army, desperate to defend his ancestral lands.
What was Darius' strategy going into this battle? Did he learn anything from his previous encounters with Alexander?
He did. Darius realized he couldn't just rely on overwhelming numbers. He needed to disrupt Alexander's formations, especially the Macedonian phalanx, which was so formidable. His plan was to use his scythe chariots, these terrifying war machines with blades sticking out from the wheels, to break up the enemy lines and create chaos.
That sounds terrifying. So how did Alexander counter these new threats?
Alexander, as always, adapted. He deployed his forces in a defensive formation, anticipating the Persian chariot charge. He also used light infantry, armed with javelins, to harass the chariots before they could reach his main lines.
So he basically let the Persians come to him, drawing them into a trap.
Exactly. The Macedonian phalanx with its wall of spears had held firm against the charging chariots. Meanwhile, Alexander, always the opportunist, he saw his chance. He led his companion cavalry in a flanking maneuver, striking at the exposed Persian sides.
Classic Alexander. It's like watching a master chess player,
yet
anticipating his opponent's moves, setting up a counterattack.
The Persian chariots, many of them disabled or just thrown into disarray, they failed to do what Darius had hoped. And Alexander's cavalry charge, it created panic in the Persian ranks. Darius, seeing his plan fall apart, he fled the battlefield again.
It seems like running from the battlefield became a bit of a habit for Darius. That must have had a devastating effect on his troops, seeing their leader flee.
It did. His flight triggered a full-scale rout of the Persian army. Gaugamela was a resounding victory for Alexander. It effectively ended the Achaemenid Persian Empire, and it established Alexander as the undisputed master of Asia.
What an incredible achievement. After years of campaigning, facing these seemingly impossible odds, Alexander had accomplished his ultimate goal. It really is a testament to his military genius, his ambition, and his ability to inspire his troops to achieve what seemed impossible. But what about the legacy of his conquests? It wasn't just about military domination, was it?
No, you're right. Alexander's victory at Gaugamela had consequences that went way beyond the battlefield. It ushered in a new era of cultural exchange between East and West, a blending of Greek and Persian traditions that would shape history for centuries. That's an important point.
Alexander, unlike a lot of conquerors, he wasn't just interested in plunder and subjugation. He was actually fascinated by Persian culture and wanted to integrate it with Greek traditions. He did. He encouraged his soldiers to marry Persian women. He adopted Persian customs. He even wore Persian clothing. His vision was this vast cosmopolitan empire where Greek and Persian cultures would coexist and enrich each other. A truly ambitious vision. It shows his forward-thinking approach to empire building. But it also makes me wonder, how successful was he in actually achieving this cultural fusion, and what was the ultimate impact of Alexander's conquests on the course of European history?
Those are questions that historians are still debating today. Alexander's empire, vast and diverse as it was, it fractured after his death. But the seeds of cultural exchange that he planted, they continued to grow. The fusion of Greek and Eastern ideas, what we call Hellenism, it had huge impact on art, architecture, philosophy, science. It really influenced the development of Western civilization.
It's amazing to think that events from over 2,000 years ago are still shaping our world today. It's been an incredible journey exploring the military and cultural legacy of Alexander the Great. But before we wrap up, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into Alexander the Great's conquest of Persia.
It's been a pleasure, and I'd like to leave our listener with one final thought-provoking question. What if Persia had adopted Memnon's scorched earth strategy at the very beginning of the war? Could they have actually stopped Alexander? How would the course of history have been different?
A fascinating question. One of those what-ifs of history. Of course, we can only speculate, but it reminds us that even though seemingly inevitable historical events are shaped by many factors, choices made, and maybe even a little bit of luck. Thanks again for joining us.